think it's beautiful because what that explains is that good architecture does not necessarily rely on a ton of money and billions of money being invested in a super expensive campus. It depends on the quality of the designer and the community building that. So if you understand those three networks well, I think you can explain to a large degree the degree of healthiness of a given society in terms of how dynamic it is, how open it is, how collaborative it is, because we've empirically measured that. Every time you double fractality or self-similarity, from an urban or architectural standpoint, on average, you obtain 32% better socialization.
Most Podern 팟캐스트.
Welcome back to Most Podern, the podcast where we explore the built environment through the lenses of design, development, and data. I'm Alex Ewan, joined by my co-host Libo Lee. Minku Kang is out today, unfortunately, but nevertheless, we're diving into a fascinating conversation on urban analytics, city performance, and the future of data-driven design. Ramon Gras is a city scientist and urban designer specializing in data-driven urban planning. A graduate of Barcelona Tech, MIT, and Harvard, he is a co-founder of Aretian Urban Analytics and Design, which uses analytics to improve cities and infrastructure. He is also the co-author of the recently released book, City Science, Performance Follows Form. Welcome, Ramon. Where does this podcast find you today?
Good morning, Alex and Libo. It's a pleasure joining you today. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Wonderful. Well, Ramon, I think we're diving into a pretty complex and rich topic, basically cities, how they function. Can you just start us off by explaining to us in your own terms what cities are and why it's important to understand them?
Absolutely. Cities are, by and large, the most complicated, sophisticated, complex, refined, abstruse, and fascinating human creation that men and women ever conceive, right? The physical spaces that we inhabit obviously have been developed by mankind over generations and centuries and ages. And they are a manifestation of the collective know-how of how the amazing things and wonderful things that we're able to achieve when we collaborate with one another in a creative and generous way. And at the same time, they project the worldview or the Weltanschauung or the mindset of a given society in a given moment in time. So essentially, it's the human creation in terms of transforming nature into physical spaces that we can inhabit and can enable human beings just to go about life, develop their fullest potential, relate with our fellow human beings and people, and hopefully have meaningful lives.
I mean, I think that's a pretty rich and interesting classification of cities. Why does it matter to understand the performance of cities and urban performance in general?
Totally, because what we've observed over time in general as urbanists and architects and civil engineers and urban designers is that even though obviously any human settlement requires a certain degree of transformation of nature, right, for us to inhabit it. The degrees to which materials, nature, the resources that we find in our surroundings have been transformed over time very dramatically. And obviously some of them create areas that generate opportunities for a sense of beauty and comfort and security and safety and opportunities to socialize in a safe context, whereas other urban environments are less desirable, less aesthetically pleasant, less charming, less inviting for social collaboration, social communication, and to live, work, communicate, and have our own personal and professional lives, right? So in that sense, we intuitively perceive with our own, if you want, superior spiritual faculties that certain urban environments are more desirable than others. So therefore, if we're able to try to, in a cognitive way, in a rational way, what are the critical ingredients and dynamics that make a city or an urban design intervention or an urban context more or less desirable, more or less inhabitable, more or less welcoming? And that helps us basically understand how we can try to shape those ingredients and dynamics in a way that through our design and management interventions in cities, we contribute to create more of these attractive and welcoming environments versus the less desirable ones, right? So if we're able to really grasp what are the critical underlying cause and effect mechanisms that explain better or not so good urbanism, we're going to be able to excel our duties as professionals and contribute to a society that's more desirable to live in, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess the idea is that cities are actually outcomes of our decision making. And if we're more deliberate about what we want, we can improve the product.
Totally. And I think urbanism is one of the domains of knowledge or profession where the human input is more clear, right? In the sense that everything that's been built by man, by the humanity, has been crafted following certain degrees of, let's say, a craft or a profession or a set of knowledge or scientific advances or technological advances, artistic advances, a sense of aesthetics. And as a result of that, we're very much used to and accustomed to, since we're like little children, right, to be evaluating those spaces and in a rather intuitive and natural way perceive if they're dangerous or welcoming or more desirable. So I think in that sense, that's one of our day-to-day experiences that we experience recurrently. And actually, for example, if we've been working in an environment that's perceived as dull, boring, uninteresting, uninspiring for a long time, that even has a psychological impact on people's mood, right? And on their attitude towards life and day-to-day activities. So I think in that sense, it's one of the human activities that really has a deeper and the most profound impact on all citizens. So I think in that sense, that makes the profession of urbanism, architecture, urban design, civil engineering very, very relevant. And obviously, it puts a lot of weight and responsibility on those professions.
I think maybe you guys are both urban professionals, right? You read a lot about this, you study a lot of cities, but maybe for the average person, maybe across different cultures, maybe they have different ideas of what a good city is. What are some unifying common goods that you see that everyone agrees on that's good for cities?
Well, there's something very interesting here. We have been conducting through the years, initially at Harvard and then more recently with Aretian, the firm, a number of studies of cities and urban territories around the world. So we've probably evaluated approximately 20% of urbanized areas around the world, and vast areas obviously of the US and Europe, large chunks, at least the most urbanized ones in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, vast areas in Oceania and the Pacific Islands, New Zealand, etc. So multiple areas around the world. And the patterns that we observe when we evaluate those environments through the lens of city science and urbanism tend to be rather universal and global. So it's not a rather tailored model that only applies to a particular region in Canada or in Sweden or in Switzerland or in Japan or in a particular neighborhood in Singapore or in Buenos Aires in Argentina. No. These patterns are global, and the interesting thing is that what we have done is we have focused on the more design and analytics the design and analytics approach in terms of evaluating those urban environments, and we've been measuring those morphological design features, so how street layouts are being conceived, right? The hierarchies of boulevards and avenues and streets and roads and walkways and pathways, as well as morphological features of architectural spaces and obviously residential spaces, houses, homes, but also offices, industrial areas, commercial spaces, as well as a number of indicators of success or failure in a way from a societal way. To what extent we can reach or achieve within walkable distance certain services, education, healthcare, commerce, retail, social services of any kind, employment opportunities, mobility and public transit opportunities. And then we've essentially identified a number of meaningful and structural correlations between patterns in urban design, architecture, and civil engineering, and to what extent these different underlying patterns contribute globally to more or less desirable aspects of day-to-day activities in human life, right? The interesting thing here, and we can talk about some of these insights and learnings, there's quite a few of them, but is that our conclusions have been almost identical to a number of conclusions conducted by other teams that have taken a complementary, albeit rather different approach. What they've done is they've shown numerous environments from all over the world to a number of bystanders or volunteers for surveys and questionnaires. And they've asked them, do you find this area attractive? Or would you like to live in this? Or would you like to work in this area? Or would you feel compelled to move to a particular city, right? And the hierarchy of ingredients that make a given city, urban context, or architectural design attractive or enticing one way or another are totally consistent between our ingredients and dynamics and these purely subjective random surveys or randomized surveys with citizens that may have an intelligent approach towards the observation of the human urban environments that they inhabit, but they're not necessarily urbanists or urban experts or sociologists or anything like that, or experts in aesthetics or fine arts. So it's just regular citizens that have an interest in the domain, and they observe and they subjectively rate areas. So these things have to do, for example, with certain patterns of street layouts, facilitate communication and accessibility at different scales, both within the internal space of an architectural space or building, but also in a given neighborhood or in a campus or a complex, a building complex, or in a city at large. So that's what we call the topology, right? The bidimensional, primarily bidimensional streets, roads, highways, boulevards that connect us. So having a high degree of connectivity, what we call urban connectivity or city-form betweenness, facilitates moving around the city in a legible and intelligible way, right? Other aspects have to do, for example, with the morphology of buildings and the overall conception, aesthetic and functional conception of cities. In that sense, the more relevant indicator in general is the quality of the urban design morphology, the shape and form of buildings and cities at large, right? Certain patterns, we've identified there's 10 archetypal patterns around the world, tend to have structurally certain qualities, aesthetically, functionally, and otherwise, that tend to be enduring and tend to be universal. So garden cities or residential garden cities that we observe initially, for example, in certain residential neighborhoods in Anglo-Saxon countries, originally in England, the UK, and the States, and then in other parts of the world, they have rather similar characteristics morphologically and in terms of the quality of life and lifestyle choices around the world, whether it's in Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in North America, anywhere, right? The same accounts for small world city networks, whether they've been shaped in Europe or in East Asia, they tend to have certain coziness and connectivity and ease of understanding of the surroundings and accessibility to services. And they create a bit of a human scale that's desirable, right? That component of human scale that things have been designed to serve the people and not the other way around. In which we can summarize that is what we call urban design excellence or city form fractality, right? Which is a holistic summary indicator that essentially measures to what extent a given morphological design of a city or a building is harmonic, aesthetically pleasant, and functional, right? And then there's a few other indicators. I'll just name a couple more. One of them obviously is density. In general, there's a lot of discussions about density because people have an intuition that very often when the level of density is too low, you're in trouble because it gets to a point where the social connectivity gets increasingly burdensome and difficult, right? When everybody is very widespread in the territory and you really rely on any car or an automobile or public transit, long commutes to do very trivial day-to-day activities like shopping or mingling with fellow neighbors or relatives and family members, etc., that gets to a point where it gets very, very difficult. We've seen that obviously in the excessive suburbanization of America. We can talk about that if you want later. And the opposite happens the same. When you have excessively dense areas, it gets to a point where there's dehumanization, right? The people, the citizens become like a small number or a piece of a massive machinery. They're just like it's not thought in a way that men and women are at the very center, at the core of this conception, right? So yes, we can really estimate for each and every context what's the level of desirable density. In general, is what we usually perceive as medium-high compact cities, right? So these are some of the features. There's others like entropy that speaks about to what extent a given morphological configuration of a city is more rigid or less rigid and open-ended. And one thing that's very important, I'll leave it here for now, is that the distribution of services and zoning of activities in a given urban area, that's fundamental. In general, Libo and Alex, the more sophisticated or unique an activity is, the more concentrated it needs to be, and the more regular, day-to-day, just frequent habits that we need to do, like sustenance, restaurants, cafeterias, a shop for food, or pharmacies, or a barbershop, or very simple day-to-day activities, the more widespread and distributed they are, the better. And then you have a whole degree of relevance where the more unique and singular an activity is, the more concentrated it needs to be and strategically located so that it serves a bigger community. So I would say that these components around human scale design, high degree of excellence or fractality, high degree of connectivity or betweenness, intermediate degrees of harmony or entropy, and appropriate levels of density are some of the features that people perceive as desirable and lively.
And so a specific use, as you're talking about, rather than a more universal use, could be something like industrial or office or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's universal in the sense that, for example, if you're conceiving to design a new neighborhood that, for example, it has a combination of both residential housing and office spaces or employment opportunities, there's this concept that has been predominantly in a more intuitive way, I would say, in recent years and decades, about the mixed-use development, right? And that's the result because that was part of the ancient wisdom in civilizations and cultures around the world, that appropriate mixed use of activities was the way to go. The problem is that obviously with the rapid and accelerated urbanization of the, let's say, especially the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, and also the incentives to create rather specialized areas, right? Where you have, this is an industrial cluster, this is a residential suburban area, this is a commercial mall. This physical atomization that seemed to be, for, let's say, geopolitical reasons, appropriate or interesting in a given moment in time, that has been proven to be a disaster in the long term. And that has been creating communities where people, they don't know their fellow neighbors, they barely communicate with them, they have this sense sense of isolation and loneliness and lack of connectivity. They very seldomly really mingle on a just casual way, like in traditional cities that you find very often, like in Europe or in the Middle East or in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America even, or in the downtown original areas in even US American cities, right? So that let's say sense of wisdom and balance that you used to find in traditional cities, that was broken for the last 70 or 80 years, that created this atomization. And what we can do right now by this means of digitally modeling cities and evaluating them to improve design is we can find the appropriate, at least ranges of desirable breakdown of activity so that the final configuration is more desirable, more amiable, and more interesting. So, but that affects both the areas that are predominantly focused on residential dwellings, but that also applies for the ones that have to do with more office or factory or logistics or production or professional environment. So in both cases, you need some degree of balance. And if you're not achieving them, the life cycle of that urban development, it may become rather short, and it may become a rather obsolete site that's undesirable and very difficult to repurpose in any way.
So cities need to be social places for occupation and interaction.
Totally. I mean, just using the ancient Greek concept of the zoon politikon, right? We are social animals, social and spiritual animals, and human species, as you know well, is one of the few ones that really, when it's at birth, it's the most reliant on their parents, mother and father, for a long time. Not only when they're like little babies that they need constant attention and protection and being fed and whatnot, but even as they grow, right? There's a long period of years and years and years where they really depend on their parents to be self-sufficient. And in that sense, that maybe is a way to indirectly force us to be social and interact with our fellow people. But in that sense, the social component is fundamental. And the extreme atomization that we've observed since 1950s particularly has been damaging those opportunities for socialization. And as you know well, I think it's just worth mentioning because many of your followers of your podcast conversations may know that, but maybe some others may not be acquainted with that. But a large degree of responsibility relies of this malpractice, from an urban design malpractice, relies on the Department of State and Defense and the U.S. Army, where in the context of the Cold War, right, there were these geopolitical studies that were suggesting that in the case of an event such as a nuclear war against the Soviet Union, if the U.S. were to grow for the next 2 or 3 decades in a rather low density capacity, that would force the Russians or the Soviets, the Slavic Soviet nations, to invest 10 times more, tenfold in nuclear missiles, right? So that they would be able to kill or annihilate, sorry for using those terms, the same amount of people they would require, the Russians or the Soviets, they would require 10 times more investment in that. That was part of the strategy that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 80s, right? It was something that was brewed in a long term over 30 or 40 years. So in that sense, that was manifested in a number of plans in the 1956, 57, 58. There's a number of even scientific papers that talk about that. Usually from the early 2000s, 2001, 4, 5, and they discuss that at large with declassified information and whatnot. So today it's not, because I think very often they blame on the automobile industry, right? The General Motors or of Chrysler or any of these other large automobile groups, or Ford, obviously, Ford Motorwagen, whatever. Even it's, in this case, that's like an after the fact. So maybe some of these automobile companies, they did an opportunistic use of that opportunity, but the main responsibility in this case was because of these geopolitics. Now, obviously, we're in a different stage in time. There's been 60 or 70 years after the fact. There's no need for committing these mistakes, and I think there's a great opportunity to correct a number of them. And as you can see these days, especially in the US, but also in other parts of the world, there's a number of mayors and urban leaders that are trying to re-densify or create a more polycentric urban design strategy, and it's difficult because after you have these massive low-density urban areas, correcting that is not, it's feasible, it's possible, but it takes a remarkable investment. And it's desirable, it needs to happen, but it is going to take a lot of thought and a lot of investment.
You know, on the topic of, surviving a nuclear attack, Alex and I did go to school in Houston, which, is one of the best cities to survive a nuclear strike.
Yes.
But I want to take a step back and really kind of focus on you. So you have a background in civil engineering. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey, how you went from there into becoming a city scientist?
Yeah. So In my family, there's a number of architects and civil engineers for some generations, and quite a few of them. I'm from Barcelona, Catalonia, in Europe, and in general, in the Barcelona area and in Catalonia, we're proud of our architectural and design and engineering heritage in general. At least the most brilliant interventions and the most brilliant professionals that we had. I think we had some interesting people, and there's been a couple of them that obviously that are relatively well known worldwide, such as Ildefonso Cerdà, the founder of modern urbanism in the mid 19th century, with his general theory of urbanization that was finally translated into English a decade ago, because it was available in Catalan, Spanish, French, but not in English yet, which was a shame. So that was finally translated by Akhtar, which was a good idea on their side. It was actually presented at the Harvard GSD around 2016, I believe, or early 2017, and that was a much deserved thing. So obviously, I think his worldview, that was a revolutionary one, was rather attractive. He was a man way ahead of his time. He was a bit of a socialist utopian, an anarchist almost, and he had a very noble concept of the humanity, and he wanted to serve the humanity. Even though he came from a rather affluent family from the countryside in Catalonia, he devoted all of his inheritance and wealth of the family into that cause. And he actually died in, I would not say extreme poverty, but in a rather difficult situation, because there had been a change in the regime against the more democratic one that he was a part of, the First Republic, where he had a lot of even political responsibility, not only as a professional. And there was a number of people that, because of professional jealousy and envy, they hated him. So all these typical problems that these brilliant people endure, right? But so obviously Ildefonso Cerdà was one of the references. I think not only in his brilliant intuitions that he was able at least to start manifesting and expressing in a way that was revolutionary at the time, but also in some of his interventions, obviously with the limited resources at the time. But I think just the worldview that he was introducing, trying to combine beauty with harmony, with efficiency, integrating the rapid advances in technology like what the rail systems were at the time, and potentially then a few decades later the automobile, etc. I think that all of that was revolutionary. And also his concept of playing particular focus on the most vulnerable people of society. So it was the time of the Industrial Revolution, especially the industrial workers. They were really not very well treated, and he focused on elevating the standards of living so that a regular working class family would have a remarkable quality of life and more or less the same opportunities of someone coming from the bourgeoisie or even the nobility, right? And also, like, for example, young pregnant women, at the time, a number of them would either die when they were giving birth, or the children would die, right? People used to have a lot more kids, and some of them would die. So he conceived areas where, through the ventilation and the quality of the water and the hygienism and whatever, people will live in a more healthy environment and context in a way. So I think all of that was really inspiring. Then obviously other architects like Jujol, for example, Josep Maria Jujol, or Antoni Gaudí, who's rather well known, and others, but also other architects and civil engineers and urbanists around the world. And my father is also a civil engineer and urbanist, my brother as well, of mine, etc., etc. So that was part of there's a ton of books about architecture, urbanism, aesthetics, and also my personal hobbies, drawing people primarily. So aesthetics and drawing and all of that since I was a little kid. So that was one thing. I've always interested in combining the more creative aspects of the profession with the more analytical ones to try to contribute to high quality standards of living. And then also something that I observed, I finished my degree around 2009-10, the worst moment of the crisis, right? That's when I was starting my professional career, and architecture and civil engineering and urbanism had been rather stable and well regarded in general around the world. And that crisis hit hard all over the world, right? For all the professionals in that domain. That was really difficult to deal with. So in that sense, one of the things that crisis brought not only was a difficult moments of turmoil and suffering for everybody, but also the people in the profession. But also it was a moment of maybe reckoning or thinking, okay, what were some of the aspects that in the profession that were really not going the best way possible, right? So one of the things that I observe in general, and this I think applies specifically in the case of architectural schools, was that first there was a bit of a remarkable stagnation in the teaching and pedagogic methodologies that was negatively affecting the profession. And I thought that was really hurting the profession. And that was creating, poorer design, more banal design, repetitive, uninteresting but also rather bombastic words that were meaningless very often. And it was like an attempt to protect mediocre designs with big words, right? And I didn't like that.
Why was that happening though?
Well, that was happening because some trends that were unhealthy became dogma. So what happens is with the let's say the new trends, especially I would say late 19th century, early 20th century, the avant-garde movements, right? The avant-garde movements. Obviously, in any moment of growth and openness and rapid change, a lot of good things happen, but also a number of other malpractice or bad things may become part of the system, unfortunately. I think what happened is that some of the vanguard movements were rather interesting, but others were not so much. And there was a collusion of two aesthetic rupture movements that were initially a little bit marginal, and after 1945 became dogma in the Western countries, and then after, because of the influence of Western countries around the world a few decades later. Those two trends were, on the one hand, the trend of the neoplasticism in the Netherlands, the Style magazine, Mondrian and all these people, they were neo-Calvinist. And as you know, the Calvinists, these radical Protestants in the 16th, 17th century, they were against the physical depiction by means of portraits and paintings and sculptures of religious figures, because they found that was like disrespectful, right? So they destroyed a lot of the art. I think some of these countries then resented their ancestors, because what happened is, a result of that, the part of Europe, for example, that remained Catholic, that protected these things, in general, the pictorial arts and fine arts remain more relevant and more higher quality than in the Protestant countries for a long time, right? So that was something that they resented later on, even the English. So that was one current. The other was the Malevich side was Marxist, materialistic in Russia before the Russian Revolution, 1910, 12, 14, before the Russian Revolution, right? And that was a materialistic trend that also wanted to tend towards abstraction, because they felt that humanizing too much, that they needed something that was a bit more devoid of whatever they would consider obscurancy at the time. So that was that's the famous painter that came up with this idea that either a white full blanket painting or a dark painting is the more sophisticated thing that you can conceive, which is bogus. It's silly, right? But it was part of this silliness of the time. Now, I think when you're in a period of openness, exploration, growth, it's normal that all these crazy ideas emerge, and it's healthy and it's good. What is unhealthy is that 3 decades after the fact, you take those two marginal sets of ideas and you make them a dogma. So as a result of that, you have all these banal constructions. They all look the same. There's a lot of social media networks, right, that make fun and they satirize these banal, boring, unpleasant trends in architecture, in art, in painting. And even there's the famous Jasmina Reza theater drama, right, called Art by Jasmina Reza, that mocks with Mr. Huntington and whatever, right, mocks this idea of the extreme abstraction being the most sophisticated thing. So in general, art has always been some degree of interpretation of nature or the physical manifestation that we observe. And when you are totally devoid of that, there's no art possible. And art is always a combination of, let's say, more sensual, intuitive, perceptive expression of feelings combined with a craft and a more of a technical component, right? It always requires objective and subjective components. If it's something purely objective, it's not art, it's a photography or something else. If it's something purely subjective, it just could be just a random act of vulgarity. So I think if it does not combine both, and it has beauty at the core and some degree of like latent, at least an emotion, that's not art. So I think the farther and farther away we got from there, the more ridiculous architecture and urbanism trends and silly things we've seen. And I think it got to a point where a lot of people is like, we cannot stand that anymore. And I think a lot of people these days are trying to capture some of the best that we inherited from previous generations, and also obviously integrate it with cutting edge design techniques from the current days, right?
And so you observed that sort of phenomena occurring at the scale of the city. Is that right?
Yeah, and at the architectural
Is that what
scale as
led
well.
you to look more into analytics as a potential path for making decisions?
Yeah. And then I was working in the Barcelona area for some time. I was not impressed by the approaches. I thought the approaches were conservative in the negative sense of the word, right? I'm sure it has a more noble and positive concept, but it was very often relying on either banal norm-induced trends because of a given norm or legal system, urban legal system, in a way, indirectly facilitates in terms of development, or driven by the greed of the more vulgar real estate agents in a way, right? So those two things I found, driven by the silliness of the worst university pseudo theories, right? So those three things I found were really bad and terrible for society. So I wanted to be as far away as possible from these things.
Can you walk us through like an example? How did you find that to not produce the results that you were looking for, and why did you kind of choose this new path through network science and analytics?
Totally. Like, for example, I observed, where I'm from, in the Barcelona area, right? There was a time in the early and mid 2000s when I was in my undergrad studies that there was a number of large interventions, and it was very apparent at that time that the mainstream leaders in urbanism ran out of ideas. And they were starting to build things that were ridiculous, absurd, banal, and incomprehensible for both professionals and citizens. For example, there was something called the Forum of the Cultures, 2004, one of the most unremarkable things that ever happened in Barcelona. They spent a lot of money on that. I don't know if you learn about that, but it was a very silly. They tried to recapture the glory of the 1992 Olympics. In the 1992 Olympics, there were some positive interventions and also some banal interventions, but there were still some positive interventions. In the 2004, it was purely banality at the time. So ugly buildings, ugly parks, ugly housing. It's the southeastern part of Barcelona in the Besòs area. No, there's a ton of jokes in Barcelona about how silly the whole concept was, how ugly and banal the buildings were, how absurd the parks were. The parks were like a totally dystopian Tim Burton park, like a Tim Burton park from one of these dark pseudo-Gothic movies, but Tim Burton is a genius. He can make it in a beautiful and funny and in an enticing way, right? They did it in an ugly way. There's another part of the city on the west. It's the second most populated city is L'Hospitalet de Llobregat. They built an entire new office district where there's the FIRA, where they celebrate the Smart City Expo World Congress, where there's a number of skyscrapers. There's like 12 or 15 skyscrapers in the area with hotels and headquarters of large urban development and energy and pharmaceutical companies in the area, primarily pharma and health tech companies. But the buildings are ugly, uninspiring. It reminds you of 1984, the Stalinistic or Nazi or fascist regime where there's these dehumanized buildings, ugly, banal, generic, very silly geometric shapes. The scale is massive. There's nothing at the human scale. It's nothing that really relies on this coziness or sense of human scale. So interventions like those two and a number of others they observed in Barcelona, but also in London, also in Paris, also in Madrid, in New York, I found what's going on. This seems to be a bit of a global phenomenon, right? So I went to MIT to reinforce the data science part. I contributed there to both urbanism and mobility studies at MIT. It was a wonderful experience for me because I loved how MIT embraced applied innovation and collaborating with both the public administration and the private sector to do hands-on, rather rigorous but well-crafted solutions to solve concrete problems. As opposed to, I think, the approach in Europe, which very often, specifically in continental Europe, in the UK, is slightly different, was very theoretical. We did a ton of algebraic math and infinitesimal calculus and very theoretical drawing techniques and all of that, but very seldomly applied to a particular project unless towards the end of the studies, right? So I love that integration of high theory with also rigorous problem solving in an applied way. I love that. And that was wonderful. I contributed to some studies and urban design recommendations for the later phases of Kendall Square, the Boston Seaport area, the second half, the early stages of conception of Union Square Innovation District in Somerville as well, the de-elevation of the McGrath Highway. So all of those experiences in trying to apply data science to both urbanism and mobility, I just found that fascinating, right? So then after that, I worked in London for a bit with Ferrovial, a large urban technology and infrastructure firm, in the design of a digital model for the expansion of the London Heathrow Airport, right? That was a #1 airport in the world, massive airport, aiming to go from 78 million passengers per annum to 125 or 30, like a big leap, to accommodate massive growth, and that required morphological design, pragmatic design of the flows of the people, functional design, and all of that, right? And a fair amount of data analytics as well. So that was fascinating. The project was a success. It went very well, but I was still ruminating and thinking about the ideas that I had about intuition. Especially, I would say, in the last year of my undergrad studies in Barcelona is when I started having, 2009, some of the intuitions that I've been proving ever since, step by step. So some of them at MIT, some of them in London, and then I wanted to really go deeper into that and really build a whole methodology and meet fellow colleagues that would be interested in that to work on that collectively, right? So I saw that Harvard was launching a new program between the Graduate School of Design, the School of Architecture and Urbanism at Harvard, and the School of Engineering. It was the first cohort ever. I applied. 350 people applied. 15 of us were accepted. I was very grateful for that opportunity, and the experience was wonderful. So started developing some of the ideas since the first day, and we were able to build a model initially about the Boston area, then the US, Boston and New York, then the US, then Europe, and then the rest of the world, right? And over the last 8 or 9 years, we've been able to prove a number of hypotheses, and I think this sense that, oh, I had this intuition, right, that was purely based on exploration and maybe a moment of intuition, or having some of these essential ideas. And when you're able to then transform that into a concrete hypothesis and then into a digital model that you can gather real data and validate and prove that that's the case, that was very, very exciting. So since we finished the thesis and the program, we launched a company, Aretian, and then also we were invited to contribute part-time in a part-time capacity as researchers at Harvard. So.
Well, it's interesting because I think how you describe urbanism before in the 20th century is similar to how I think I still think about urbanism quite a lot, which is I observe something, I notice something, and then I start to theorize about it. I start to design around that. But you're taking a step further, which is you're observing something, and then you're trying to quantify it, or you're trying to describe it in more empirical terms. Was that the foundation and the thesis for Aretian, and how did that get launched?
Yeah, it was that plus a couple of other things. One was that the unexpected degree of superficiality that we could observe, for example, very often in architecture studio evaluations, right? I'm sure all of you and many of the people who are listening to this podcast these words may sound familiar to them, because I was always in this intersection between architecture, civil engineering, urbanism, and I thought that it came to a point where extreme specialization was hurting the profession, right? We needed a bit more of a Renaissance men and women approach, right? Where we had a bit more of a holistic, integrative approach, like in the 15th century or the 19th century in a different way. And one of the things that you could observe is that in general, the students, if they have a modicum of, let's say, honesty, when they see a group of 10 teams presenting, they do have a sense of, oh, this was outstanding, brilliant, this was mediocre, this was terrible, this is, and obviously you, out of respect for your fellow colleagues, you may present it in an amiable and friendly way, but in reality, deep down, if this was really a genius and this was really a piece of crap. I'm sorry for saying that. So, but in general, the students know that. I mean, they may be more or less inspired in a given day, but they have a sense of things. So, and it seemed very often it was the professors and the faculty that were confused. And they would take something that was rather superficial, but if it was shiny or extreme in an unnecessary way, they would have an incentive to say that was like a brilliant thing. And other people that maybe perceived something that integrated cutting edge or contemporary techniques with some of the best ideas inherited from the past, that was disregarded as, this is just anachronistic, or it's not appropriate for the current times, or whatever, or almost reactionary. And everybody knew this was bogus, but the students, obviously, they have this situation where they depend on their faculty for passing the grades and whatnot. So I think in that sense, but it got to a point where the critical mass of indignation, I think, was too large. So that was one component, and we felt that there was a need for reinforcing the more subjective component with the more objective component. And in the more objective realm of things, it's very difficult. If you don't measure something, if you're not able to, in a universal way, evaluate something, it's very difficult to really prove the point. And that's been universally understood by one language which is global, which is mathematics, that's underlying in almost everything that we do. And it's the pure abstraction that's behind the rules under which we live, whether we understand them fully or not, right? Or to some extent. And so you need some of that. Obviously, you need more than that, more than mathematics, but that's fundamental. So being able to measure things, quantify that, create performance measures of success or failure, and then evaluate them out of a large enough observation around the world so that it's representative. It's not, this is a minor observation in this particular urban area, or this is an exception or an outlier here or there. No. This is a global phenomenon, right? So that was critical. And also, I had this intuition that there were certain patterns that may not be trivial, but are lasting and very, they have profound impact, right? So if you're able to measure, for example, how density impacts lifestyle quality in general, or how these morphological patterns shape certain human collaboration and communication patterns, we felt that that was very interesting. So I was reading a few network science and network theory articles and books, which I found very, very inspiring, especially because they do have a rather high degree of solvency in social communications and social sciences, right? So to a large extent, we can model social hierarchies and social communication for good or bad by means of network science. Obviously, once you understand how people communicate and collaborate with one another, and those patterns emerge, you're able to do something which is fascinating, which is understand that some of these patterns are healthier and more humane than others. And some of them facilitate people developing their potential at their fullest with dignity, and others hinder that potential and create more rigid and arbitrary structures that indirectly may oppress people or may limit at least their capabilities and human development. So being able to understand that, and the beauty of that was that when we started evaluating these architectural projects or these urban environments, and these 10 emerging network typologies emerged, there was a perfect synchrony between the small world urban development and the small world network, which is called like that. Tree network and the garden city, the linear network and the linear city, the reticular network and the reticular or grid city, the scale-free network and the fractal city, the random network and the random city, etc., etc. And that manifested itself in the aesthetics, but also in the function, by means of mathematical formulas. Some of them would have a log normal distribution, others a beta distribution, or a gamma distribution, or a Gumbel or Bible distribution. So different, or an exponential distribution or a power law. And that was fascinating, that these intuitions that you may have as a designer, going around the world and observing it and say, look, this is suggesting to me this type of pattern, which is suggesting to me this type of sensation, subjective feeling. Is there any way that I can present that in abstract means and validate that that's the case? Yes. So we've been able to do that. And I think when we started to validate these assumptions is when we said, look, this thing that we've been trying to validate since 2000, we're onto something, and this is really serious.
It seems to me that a lot of this was occurring in your head at a moment, too, when technology was finally allowing people to analyze and assess cities in a way that was much more objective, rather than the subjective manner that I think you were reacting to that was occurring in schools, and I agree continues to occur in schools. What were some of those technological innovations, and how did you guys leverage those in order to do your work?
Yeah, one of them was obviously being able, one had to deal with the capabilities. So the moment that the digitization of the urban world allows you to have increasingly better and more accurate digital replicas of urban environments, that represents a big leap, because you can start looking at the city as an urban continuum, as a complex system, rather than just a myriad of small observations or interventions, right? That was the typical approach. Like even if you take the Christopher Alexander's the Urban Patterns book and whatnot, the pattern language, there's some degree of qualitative conceptualization of these ideas, but it's not fully developed, right? So I think, yes, being able to digitization through AutoCAD and then GIS and Rhino 3D and all these other software capabilities, that helped. The second one that helped is that the reduction in computational cost enabled to cross a major boundary, is that since the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, a number of mathematical theorists were conceiving hypotheses that they were not able to prove because the data was not available in the 40s, in the post-war period, right? However, in the late 90s, especially in the early 2000s, because the computational cost was reduced dramatically, you were able, with a singular laptop or personal computer at your home, to run these analyses in a way that is totally autonomous, and you don't need to rely on massive computation and waiting for 3 days. So that was a big change, right? And I think finally something else, which is that in general, something that's been missing in general is the juxtaposition of disciplines. I think this atomization in silos of disciplines has been very hurtful for the profession. And when you end up like looking at something only from the pure perspective of material science, or from the pure perspective of trying to impose political ideologies onto a technical professional like urbanism, right? That, and some of these political ideologies may be very biased very often, right? One way or another. When you're trying to maybe be too much driven by what you've seen over the last years or decades, because that's what you're accustomed to, rather than trying to get closer to the truth, I think that's when you end up being boring, and the society creates these banal systems that people end up hating, right? So I would say, yeah, a reduction of computational cost, digitization of the urban environment, and the ability to integrate by means of complex systems and network science multiple domains of knowledge. I think those three were the critical ones.
But from your perspective, I'm very interested in this idea of siloing because I experience the same phenomenon. One, it requires someone to be a polymath like you, someone who can
Thanks.
do math, but can also draw, can also think, can also understand history. So there is a sort of just talent, I think, perspective that needs to be involved with in order to address big issues like cities. But what other reasons are we experiencing this where, you have somebody who's only looking at the city from an urban economics perspective, or only from an architectural perspective, or only from a, let's say, grassroots cultural perspective?
Well, this has to do with some of the unintended consequences of the post-World War II. But now on the social side, we were talking about that on the arts and in the domain of urbanism and architecture. I think some of this worldview was particular to that area, 50s, 60s, and so on, that's starting to be in deep crisis in the early 2000s, was that this little renaissance that we had in the 19th century, during the times of the Industrial Revolution, created this thing that the British did with a lot of enthusiasm, that they put an effort on classifying professions and domains of knowledge and science and subscience and subdomains of knowledge in medicine and in engineering, in physics, in chemistry, in mathematics, etc., right? I mean, that was an interesting effort to classify and to understand things from the top down and whatnot. A lot of deductive reasoning, which was necessary, combined to some extent with inductive reasoning and empirical validation. But what that created was a type of professional that it's the apogee of the MBA, right? When the Masters in Business Administration started to become very predominant in the business world, and there was this extreme atomization of professions, and they needed all of a sudden someone who would be the leader and the savior, and that was the MBA, right? So what that created was numerous generations of leaders that were not necessarily experts in the field, and they came up very often with a strong bias towards finance, for example, on top of any other consideration, on top of product, on top of design, on top of operations and customer service. They focused primarily on finance, and it created a number of monsters, right? Like the gigantic growth of certain industries that you know very well, that in the 2007 or 8 crisis were very apparent, right? But I think what matters here is that extreme specialization that limited people's understanding of the profession, and then this need for a savior who's an MBA who doesn't know much about the profession, that really hurt the professional culture of many companies. So I think one metaphor that I like using a lot, because I think it's aesthetically beautiful and it can be very inspiring, is the concept of the medieval guilds or atelier, right? In Europe, but also in Asia and other parts of the world, where you have a workshop where people collectively work towards a common goal. You start as an apprentice, then you become an official, then you become a master, then you become the leader of the workshop or atelier. There's a sense of common purpose, there's a sense of generosity, there's a sense of growth, generational contribution, where the elderly, like in the famous painting from Velázquez, right, in Sevilla, where he depicts the 3 ages of men. So this intergenerational exchange of knowledge, and there's this natural relationship, and people can both express their individuality and at the same time contribute in a generous way. I think that works because it operates at the human scale, and that was the foundation for the Renaissance Revolution. It was also the foundation 3 centuries later of the Industrial Revolution around the world. Once we get very far away from these human scale social interaction patterns and everything's fully standardized, and you have these ultra specialized professionals that they only know about the very narrow domain of knowledge, and the savior who doesn't know much about anything, like the MBA, sorry for saying that, you have dysfunctional society where nothing works, and collectively starts making silly decisions, extremely biased by either one of these considerations alone or finance in the most vulgar way, right, and terrible way. So that's what happened in the West, and then I think to a lesser extent in the rest of the world in recent decades, and I think that's been negative. We need to go back to this human scale where people have both this individual contribution and also this collective contribution, I think.
So I want to bring our conversation maybe back to the city. Let the MBAs who are listening to this take a breather a little bit. But we've mentioned network science a lot, and I think it's worthwhile at this moment to kind of lay the groundwork. Like, what is network science, and why is it important as a technique to analyze cities?
Yeah, totally. So many people may be familiar with this concept of graph theory, right? That, for example, Euler, the Russian, German, Swiss mathematician and thinker from the Age of Enlightenment, when he created the very first, at least known, graph network in Königsberg, what today is Kaliningrad, right? Is this enclave from Russia in Poland and what used to be Germany back in the day, etc., right? So Königsberg was a German cultural city back in the day. So Königsberg, the city of the bridges, he did this graph abstraction of the numerous bridges that connect the city. It's something you could do in St. Petersburg or in Amsterdam or in Venice or any of these types of cities for that purpose, right? Or if you will, for example, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the US, for example, right? Bridge city in that regard, or New York to a lesser extent. So when he did that, Euler was obviously one of the greatest mathematicians ever. He was a great contributor. And he started coming up with this relationship between visual abstractions of geometry and enduring mathematical relationships. And obviously, after the Greco-Roman contributions and other Arabic and Chinese mathematical contributions to geometry, but I would say obviously two of the giants in that domain had to do with Euclides in the Greek times, the Euclidean geometry, and then with Euler. That has been influenced dramatically everything, how we understand 3D spaces and whatnot, right? Globally, around the world. So I think that was increasingly developed. There were also some ideas about group theory, like Évariste Galois, the French mathematician, who died romantically at the age of 20 in a duel in the times of the 1820s, right? Fantastic, very fascinating life. He died for romantic reasons. He and another gentleman were chasing the same lady, so they had this duel, right? And he died. Anyway, so he also did some contributions between the tender ages of 16 and 20, right? Even the night before he was killed in that duel, he was writing as many equations as he could so that his brother could save them in case he would lose the duel, as unfortunately happened, right? Anyway, so some of these people did wonderful contributions, and I think, especially in the 20th century, a number of French and Hungarian mathematicians did a big push in that domain, including Paul Erdos and a number of others. And obviously, more recently, Benoit Mandelbrot, right? The Polish-French mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, who conceived the concept of fractals, these geometric structures that self-repeat themselves at multiple scales, like Russian dolls in a way. So all these mathematical theories did great contributions there. And I think, essentially, network theory is this ability to explain the physical and the abstract world as an abstraction in terms of nodes of the network, which are agents. That could be people, could be buildings, could be countries, could be entities that have a defined constitution, and the edges representing the relationship between these different agents between one another in a dynamic fashion over time, right? And these networks, they tend to have their own physical visual manifestation, a certain pattern of the network, but also mathematical relationships of how they evolve over time. The networks tend to have a hierarchy. Certain nodes have a bit more of a more predominant role within the network, and others have a bit more of a secondary or tertiary or quaternary role within the hierarchy, right? And some flows are in one direction, some other flows are in bidirectional. So all these complex visual and mathematical depiction of human and social and material relationships by means of network science emerge as a theory and has been revolutionary. That's, for example, the foundation of these ideas from Évariste Galois of the satellite system that we have today, and that obviously enables us to have the internet, for example. It's not a joke. Like the whole internet that was developed since the 70s between MIT and the CERN in Switzerland and whatnot, all of that would not be possible without the ideas of Évariste Galois, the French mathematician who died very young, right? So all these concepts around group theory and network theory have been instrumental for rapid acceleration of technology and science and solutions in raising the standards of living around the world. And network science is behind, for example, the improvements in telecommunications. It's behind the improvements in mobility and logistics. It's behind the improvements in electronics, medicine, and a number of other domains of knowledge. So it's an emerging field of knowledge that I would say, specifically in the last 20 to 25 years, has seen a remarkable expansion.
I think it's actually a profound idea, which is maybe intuitive to a lot of us who study or work in cities, that cities are not necessarily just objects. They're in fact organisms that are made up of networks like you're talking about. I'm thinking a lot about Kevin Lynch, another graduate of MIT, who was talking about the imageability of cities, looking at analyzing cities from a different perspective. But he talks about how cities are broken down into paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks, and that combination of those different things creates what we think of as a city. He was basically looking at that in the 1960s in terms of how we started studying how we experience cities, much more from a qualitative standpoint. I'm wondering right now in this moment of intense complexity, I think that's part of your underlying story is that things have just gotten more complex and we can't address them like we did 100 years ago.
Yes.
What are some of the things that are causing stress to the network right now?
Well, a number of them. That's a very loaded question, Alex. I appreciate that. And I think a very good one. A number of them because the lack of understanding or the very limited understanding of these series as complex networks created a number of persistent biases in the system. And that's been over time creating these remarkable pressures in society in a negative way, in terms of negative externalities, right? Like, let me give you a few examples of that nature. One of them, for example, has been that because of this lack of understanding of the factor of density in an urban territory, this joke that some people make that any American city is a combination of a small Manhattan at the center and a large Phoenix outside of it, that became almost a norm for the 400 metropolitan statistical areas across the US, right? For the last 60 or 70 years, where you go to Denver, you go to Philadelphia, you go to Houston, Texas, you go to Kansas City, you go anywhere, and you very axiomatically perceive, obviously the older cities like Boston or Philadelphia, to some extent New York, and a few others, maybe San Francisco, etc. They may have a bit more of an European heritage in that sense, but overwhelmingly, this rapid growth of the 20th century has been really reshaping those cities in this small Manhattan at this core at the center and this vast Phoenix around it. And that's not good. That's not good because it creates a dual society. Like, for example, in Chicago, in the US, there's this very widespread understanding, especially people living in certain parts of the suburban areas, especially the lower income areas, working class citizens and more humble families. They have a sense that when they go to downtown Chicago, they say that they go to Chicago, as if they were living in Japan or in Lagos, Nigeria, or in Vancouver, Canada. No, you are in Chicago, right? And the problem is that this aggressive segmentation in urbanism created these monsters. Again, one is the exacerbated downtown, that's a bit dystopian. The other is these vast suburban areas, poorly connected, where people don't know their fellow neighbors, where their neighborhood life is rather limited, sense of isolation, a lot of depression, and that's probably indirectly causing some of these problems with drug consumption and alcohol consumption and other addictions in that sense, right? In some of these communities, because there's this Harvard professor that did a wonderful job at the Kennedy School, Robert Putnam, right, with his book Bowling Alone and a number of other Our Kids and other books and studies where he explains how this extreme suburbanization he's been measuring, for example, social interaction decline across the US over years and decades. He's seen that the fellowship membership attendance of cultural centers, artistic centers, hobby centers, religious centers, unions or professional syndicates of professionals, etc., have been declining dramatically, and he associates that also with the spikes in separations and divorce in the US. So this physical atomization contributed to people very rarely meeting their relatives and their citizens and contributing to the disintegration of the family in a broad sense. And this thing that, for example, until a couple of generations ago, it was very natural. Yeah, you would mingle as you grow with your parents and brothers and sisters and whatever, but you also have this broader network of cousins and whatever that creates an interesting network. And that impedes or makes it really difficult for certain extreme cases of abuse to happen. Because if someone becomes maybe too aggressive or too strange, their brother or their sister may say, hey, calm down, take it easy, this is not ideal, right? So this decline in socialization has been dramatic. And then a number of other things have been, for example, have to do with the very unequal economic opportunities in the territory, right? As a result of these urbanism patterns, what we observe is that this geographic atomization of activities, when it was combined, for example, with aggressive outsourcing of manufacturing industries, that created limited urban areas where people could thrive and have a living and being able to financially support themselves, have a family, have children, perpetuate themselves, whatever, versus an increasing number of Americans and Europeans and Asian citizens, etc., around the world are finding it more and more difficult, even though they have more academic degrees on paper, to be able to be self-reliant, to rent or buy or purchase a house, right? Have kids, that's increasingly become a burden and very difficult to deal with. So this intertwined relationship between urbanism, I think economics is fascinating. It's one of the aspects that we evaluated the most.
Well, I think for me, that's the question that I really have. So if I were to take a devil's advocate position, I would say that cities are first and foremost economic engines. They're created to create trade, commerce, interaction at a financial and economic level between humans. Of course, there's a lot of benefit that comes out of it, culture, art, beautiful places, things of that nature. And I see a lot of, I think a lot of what you're talking about reflects, especially a European standpoint, if you don't mind me saying so, in the sense that as an American, I like to go to Europe because I experience a lot of the things that you talk about make good cities. I think in your own parlance in Spanish, this sort of idea of sobremesa, where you can go out and you can interact with people that are related to you, but also might not be related to you. So my question becomes, especially as someone who's looking at the data and is also interacting with clients, cities, I presume, how do you prioritize these things? Is it about economic development, or is it about community and socialization and all these downstream effects of a properly functioning society?
That's critical. So the three main networks or urban systems that we model are the urban infrastructure, so the material, technology and infrastructure, the network of industries, and the network of talent. And if you look at those, obviously the top two are human-based, and the third one is the physical spaces that we inhabit at the service of the people, right? So in a way, the three are focused on people. So I think if we look at the problem through this lens and we evaluate these networks in these three systems, we see that the three systems are complementary to one another. So the urban physical network tells us how easy it is to access a service, to socialize with people, to have an environment that's highly walkable, where you can, for the most part, walk or at least find a number of attractive employment opportunities within walkable distance of where you live, or well connected through public transportation at least. So that's one fundamental component, the physical and the social interaction and the appropriate levels of density, the human scale. The second one is the network of industries. That's essentially what we can do collectively as a society, and we can measure that, right? If you take, for example, Ricardo Hausmann and Cesar Hidalgo's theory between Harvard and MIT over the last 15 years, that's a revolutionary network science approach to economics that's been proven to be very, very insightful, in the sense that by evaluating a small subset of data in economics, in their case, the exports of a given country, of all the 200 independent countries or states around the world over time, year by year, you can explain what this country can collectively do, right? That finding that they came up with is revolutionary, it's brilliant, it's wonderful. It enables a lot of opportunities, but what we found is that it needed to be landed into a more detailed, delicate, granular scale. So we took that model, we territorialized it. So right now, we can decompose that into small units of 1,000 residents, if you will, or even a given building. And that gives us this finely tuned level of finesse or detail that's appropriate to understand how that economic ecosystem operates, what are their strengths and weaknesses, what these people can collectively do in terms of producing services or physical products, and how competitive that is, and strategies that we can pursue to improve or to strengthen that industry or that group of people, right? So I think that's one fundamental component. And the third network, the network of talent, is critical because it's the small networks of how people collaborate on a daily basis to advance that network that we can describe as a large network that slowly evolves over time, right? So if you understand those three networks well, I think you can explain to a large degree the degree of healthiness of a given society in terms of how dynamic it is, how open it is, how collaborative it is, how open to embrace new positive ideas it is, and to scale them rapidly if those ideas are good. So we understand that those three systems really explain to a large extent a lot of the economic variance in a given city, the sense of opportunity, the diversity of educational opportunities, the diversity of professional opportunities, the diversity of services that a person can reach in a given city or urban context. And obviously, it's a simplification of the world, but we think it encapsulates to a large extent some of the fundamental ingredients on dynamics for success.
So I'm a relatively simple person, and cities are really complex things, and
sure
there's a
you're-
lot of things to measure. But if you had to boil it down to one metric that differentiates a successful city
Yes.
versus an unsuccessful city, what would that metric be?
Yes, great question. So when we decompose this into the topological, morphological, fractality, entropy, the complexity of the industry, the density of the industry, the sophistication, all of that, all of these metrics are meaningful and they explain part of the picture. But there's one fundamental variable, LIBO, that replicates itself into the three main scales or the three main networks, the physical, the collective economy, and the individual small groups, which is the degree of self-similarity, fractality, or what we can call harmonic polycentrism, right? certain types of networks, if they have two properties, are better than others. And the problem is that those two properties are rarely combined in a way that operates properly. Those two properties are an egalitarian foundation where all the nodes are interconnected, and they can relatively easily, through a couple of leaps, the famous 6 or 7 leaps for Michael Jackson or Kevin Bacon, right? With the famous actors or musicians or artists, right? The famous degrees of separation, or I don't know how they call it in English, whatever, right? So with a limited number of leaps, you can reach critical services or critical people in the network, or nodes or services. So that's this egalitarian foundation that creates a system where everybody counts, everybody matters, everybody in a way is protected, and at the same time a hierarchy, but not a random oppressive hierarchy. It's a hierarchy of competence and service. In other words, if you have, for example, a society where it's self-contained and self-sustainable, but at the smallest scale, if you take the Inuits, for example, in Northern Europe, right, or parts of Asia, parts of Canada, great. You have the father, the mother, the children, great. The parents cook, they are the teachers, they are providers, they hunt for the food, they build the igloos, whatever, they're self-sustainable, wonderful. But it's almost impossible they're going to be evolving from, I mean, they've been living that for centuries. You really need this collaboration that Alex was describing before, right? This sense of, if you want to use the classics, Adam Smith's complex networks and collaboration and diversification of professions. So once you get this complex network, you can indirectly measure how sophisticated that network is because of these two ingredients. That you have a basic egalitarian network and a hierarchy based on competence, which is a porous hierarchy. It's not an oppressive hierarchy. It's a porous hierarchy where you can increasingly grow in the hierarchy depending on your talents, your ability, your effort, your sacrifice, or your qualities. And I think when you have a right balance between the two, you create a society where everybody can shine.
Are these successful properties of all kind of network systems, or do they just apply to urban networks? Like, do they also apply to communication networks, social networks?
These properties are universal, Libo. These are universal. And if you want to use equivalent terms that we can use in a more traditional way, that could be liberty and egalitarianism, right? If you have this freedom to excel, and if you have this egalitarian in the sense of that you care about your fellow citizens and everybody's connected, I think, yes, they are universal. For example, there's something interesting. There's a paper by Professor Laszlo Barabasi and a number of other researchers that was published, I think, a year ago, where they evaluated the morphological conditions of the human brain, which may apparently be like totally different subject, right? What they've seen is that the highest degree of fractality, the same notion in the network of the brain, is correlated with health, intelligence, emotional balance, etc., low crime, etc., right? If you look at that, for example, in mobility, the more self-similar networks reach everybody in the minimum allotted time, and everything is more connected in the most efficient time, fewer emissions to the atmosphere. If you apply that to electronics, the same. So yeah, it's a universal property that it's interesting, right? It applies to so many systems. It's interesting.
Well, this begs the question, which cities are the healthiest by these qualifications?
Okay, these are the questions that I hate, Alex and Libo. I need to say that. But when that's been asked in the sense of this or that other city, or I mean, we can talk about neighborhoods, if you will, or concrete urban environments. If you talk about the specific properties that make them better, objectively better, I would say yes. Self-similarity from a morphological standpoint, and that applies both at the urban scale but also at the architectural scale. Let me give you an example that I think is universal, and I think it's a beautiful one. When you look at Pinterest manifestations of vernacular architecture in rural parts of China, in rural parts of India, in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Northern Europe, for example, these churches in Northern Europe where you have a structure that's self-repeatedly numerous times, built with wood, for example, or in China you have a main structure, circular, and then it's repeated over and over, or you have something similar in pre-Columbian or pre-European civilizations in the Americas before the Europeans moved there, right, and whatnot. Or also, obviously, for example, in a lot of churches in Europe, for example, or in Africa, you have these structures that self-repeat themselves. That's intuitively perceived as beauty, pleasant, harmonic, and functional, and it's a universal factor. And that applies to, and I think it's beautiful because what that explains is that good architecture does not necessarily rely on a ton of money and billions of money being invested in a super expensive campus. It depends on the quality of the designer and the community building that. If the quality of the designer, the world building the community is geared towards beauty in this more humane understanding of things, they can build these wonderfully attractive environments. Like, you know, these very picturesque small towns in the countryside in England. Everybody goes there, they takes a million pictures because they may not call it fractal structures, but what they intuitively perceive is this is human scale, it's beautiful, it's cozy, I would like to live here, at least for a few months of the year or something, right? They immediately feel drawn to that when I see a picture of that. So I think this is an interesting manifestation of that. And I'd say yes. So I would say number one, this concept of fractality or self-similarity is the most relevant one. Why? Because we've empirically measured that. Every time you double fractality or self-similarity, from an urban or architectural standpoint, on average, you obtain 32% better socialization. That means that, for example, all else being equal, you can access everything using 32% fewer time for the commutes in the morning, for example. Or therefore, you're wasting 32% less of your time, right, in those commutes. So you have more time to live, to be with your family, with your friends, with your coworkers, with the people that you know, etc. So the same in terms of the output. The economic output of these communities is remarkably larger. For example, we have evaluated the 70-odd neighborhoods in Barcelona proper, for example. If you take the 3 or 4 better design in general neighborhoods versus the bottom 3 or 4, the difference in terms of pattern of socialization is 6-1. 500% more easier to socialize. And it's interesting because then when you look at the price per square meter of the urbanism is also 500 or 600% more expensive in this area. So there's almost a direct financial correlation in terms of indirect measure of desirability by means of real estate finance that establishes this relationship between urban design desirability and social interaction, which is interesting, right? So first of all, fractality. The second is density. So every time you double density, you do not obtain a 32% improvement, you obtain a 19%, which is still remarkable, almost 20%. And if you can achieve that multiple times, that's wonderful. The problem is, as we said before, that there's a limit and a desirable value for every context. And if you surpass and you go well beyond that, it gets to a point where you have diminishing returns and even dehumanization in a way, right? So I would say the second most relevant is density. The third would be connectivity. The fourth would be sustainability or material efficiency. And the fifth would be harmony or entropy, where if you take, for example, on one extreme, highly regimented urban pattern that looks like a pure grid, boring grid, 90 degrees, everything is a square. It's a very rigid understanding of cities. And let's take a totally organic, meandering, confusing, sensual, random pattern on the other side. Both extremes are negative because they both have embedded limitations in terms of ability to socialize. So usually for harmony or entropy, which is this indirect measure of chaos in the system, you want the intermediate degree because that intermediate degree combines a basic structure that makes everything efficient with more interesting, more creative understanding of the territory that enables for these great hubs or concentrations of activity to emerge. Great hubs in culture, great hubs in the arts, in finance, in universities and research centers, in hospitals. And that concentration is what makes cities fascinating and different from little villages in a way, right?
So I'm a young, upwardly mobile professional. Let's pretend I am. Where should I go to live if I want all of these things?
Well, we have measured that. We can offer our services by a reasonable price. And no, I'm kidding. We did actually, for example, evaluate a couple of years ago the 400 metropolitan statistical areas in the US, 392, over the last 30 years, right? And we projected them into the future. And it was fascinating to see that there were 2 leading indicator families of variables that are anticipating how attractive or desirable or prosperous or dynamic a given city will be in the coming years, right? Around 40% of them have to be 40 to 45% with urbanism, urban design, amenities, distribution of activities, and the other 40 to 45% has to do with the wealth of the knowledge economy. So those 2 combined explain around 80% of the complexity, and then obviously you have hyper-local factors that may disrupt that one way or another, right? But at large, in general, you can explain around 80% of the evolution for the 5, 7, 8, 10 years to come in terms of those 2 factors, the quality of urbanism, the quality of the knowledge economy. In there's one living indicator which is very interesting, which is innovation intensity. It's basically the percentage of people that are working on knowledge-intensive activities or innovation-related activities, the more creative and the more disruptive types of professional activities. Usually that percentage is in developed countries around 10, 11, 12% on average. But that small percentage of people, especially when it's concentrated in any given area where you have 35, 40, 45% of those types of professionals working in concert within physical proximity, that tends to create a massive surplus that we measured. We measured the 50 top innovation districts across the US, and they produce per capita 25 times more wealth per employee. That's why there's this massive global competition everywhere. All the global cities, in Shanghai, in Singapore, in Panama, in Mexico City, in New York, obviously in the San Francisco Bay Area, to craft and develop and conceive in Cape Town in South Africa, to develop a highly successful innovation district that can not only propel your local talent, but at the same time create opportunities for talented professionals from all over to go to your city, live and contribute to the prosperity and to the well-being of that community. So that, I think that component of concentration of knowledge-intensive activities in these highly amiable urban environments, especially when, for example, the rate, so one thing that we measure that's critical here, Alex, is that there's a proper tension between the growth of the city and the cost of living, right? That's one of the reasons why, as you know, San Francisco has been struggling in recent years, and they lost almost 500,000 citizens in recent years, right? They were flocking to other cities, whether it's Denver or Austin or anywhere, or Portland, Oregon, whatever, right? And one of the reasons was that the cost of living was increasingly higher, but the average income was not catching up. And as a result, the tension was too aggressive that people was silly to live there, right? For a lot of people. So, whereas in other cities, there's still a healthy relationship between the income that you have as an individual or as a family, or right, or with your partner, with your couple, wife or whatever, versus what you pay to survive and to self-sustain yourself. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of people move to Austin, for example, or Kansas City to a lesser extent, or Madison, Wisconsin, et cetera, while we see some degree of comeback in Pittsburgh or in other cities like Ann Arbor, Michigan, or a number of others, right? And not to mention, obviously, Boston, right? So I think in that sense, the areas where they have a high degree of innovation intensity, that's healthy, especially if it's concentrated. The areas where they have a diverse set of cultural opportunities. If a given city is not culturally dynamic, people and young people don't want to go live there, right? In general, it's not desirable. If you have an area where you have medium-high levels of compactness and density, where you can, with public transit, high-quality public transit that enables you to access any given area within the city, the metro area, within a reasonable time frame. It's not this thing, for example, in New York, you take an application for one of these private taxi systems, right? Uber, Lyft, or whatever, and it says 16 minutes. You can go from this area of downtown to this other area in 16 minutes, and then you take the cab, and it takes 55 minutes. It's like, this is a robbery. What's going on, right? A proper city, that should not happen. You should be able, if it says 16 minutes, to be there in 16 or 17, not in 1 hour. So I would say high fractality, high innovation intensity, high diversity of cultural opportunities, appropriate tension between income and cost of living. And in general, the last one is this famous concept of the 50-minute city standards that has often been misunderstood, but is a healthy one, which basically means that the services are widespread and distributed in the territory in a way that within walkable distance of 15 or 20 minutes or biking, you can access the fundamental day-to-day activities. This is a very healthy concept. It creates more desirable environments, and in general, it's a good predictor of desirability of a given area.
So this sounds amazing. Like, if I'm someone who is participating in shaping the city, who is that ideal person to contact you to say, hey, like, I'm a stakeholder. I would like more information for you to help me make my city better? Because we know cities are managed and shaped by a whole number of people. Who is that archetype that you look for that is the lead person to make these changes?
Good question. There are two main types of professionals that can play that role, regardless of their more individual professional or academic background, right? One is, in general, public administration leaders that are responsible for the development of their city at large. Very often these days, they have a lot of open-ended questions that they really don't know how to answer, right? It's like, if you ask them, okay, what's the desirable density for this plot of land with 90 hectares, 125 hectares, 200 hectares? They have no clue how to answer that question. If you ask them, what is the right balance between housing, residential dwellings, and employment opportunities in this area, or office spaces, or manufacturing, they have no clue. If you ask them things like, what should be the industries or the sectors or the technology domains that we should be nurturing in a way by means of investment and conditions and universities and whatnot, and critical infrastructure that we should be supporting here in a deliberate way to create a prosperous area based on the legacy that we have. For them, it's really difficult to answer these questions in a solvent way without saying very generic things that are a bit of a trap, right? To use the famous Star Wars meme quote, right? With the calamari thing. So the general, whatever his name was. So so in that sense, usually the director of urban development is a very natural stakeholder for this type of development. The director of urbanism, also the director of economic strategy as well, and sometimes the director of mobility. So those three people are usually the more direct, natural, urban, let's say, public administration leaders that we can interact and then usually then they talk about these types of opportunities with the mayor or the rest of the mayoral team, the chief of staff or whatever, right? On the private side, especially in a country like the US, where a large chunk of urbanism is driven to a large extent by the real estate industry, right, in a way, I think it's also very important to remember that the private sector should be more and more sensitive to these considerations because there's a myriad of failures in residential neighborhoods, of failures in theoretically supposed to be mixed-use urban development environments, right? A failure in innovation districts. Approximately 70% of innovation districts around the world have failed because they were not properly conceived, right? And also real estate in general, not only like real estate developers, that counts universities when they need to grow their campus, hospitals when they have a lot of investment and funding to expand remarkably their campus, and they're going to be influencing the urban fabric remarkably, right? Large technology firms, technology parks, manufacturing firms, etc., logistics companies, all these companies that make this once-in-a-lifetime investment, or not once-in-a-lifetime, of a myriad of, like, for example, mid-sized interventions throughout the territory that occur on a constant basis, but they really are affecting the shape and the dynamics of the city. But if you do not understand the system in terms of the bigger picture, the chances of you being able to commit a number of mistakes are remarkable. And we've seen, for example, the demise of Quayside, right, in Toronto with Sidewalk Labs and Google. That was a major failure. We've seen what happened with some of the headquarters of Amazon, right, especially in Queens, in Long Island, in New York. That was not appropriately approached in terms of the engagement with the local citizens. That was another failure. We've seen in South Korea, New Songdo City. That was a bit of a failure. The economic city in Saudi Arabia 10 years ago was also a bit of a failure. So there's a number of, obviously in Las Vegas, they poured a ton of money there, a number of investors in Nevada to create a more amiable, family attractive, and for young couples and families and professionals. So it's not like just people gambling and losing all their family savings into silly things in the casinos. And that's been a bit of a failure as well, right? So we've seen a number of failures in urbanism because they didn't have an appropriate holistic vision. So I think both these urban leaders in charge of these large or mid-sized developments and private developers, whether they're just appropriate developers or companies or universities or hospitals making interventions in the territory, the most natural ones. Yeah.
It seems like you're underlying a basic fact that cities involve a ton of investment and there's a lot at stake. They're also not software, it's hardware. You have to build it and you have to see if it works. If it doesn't work, there's not much you can do with it. And we're seeing the consequences of that at a large scale in a lot of places. Some formerly successful cities, some emerging cities that have never really gotten there. It looks like Aretian is really at the forefront of trying to figure out what are the things that make cities work and what makes things tick so that we can more decidedly focus our investment and our resources towards success rather than uncertainty. So that leads me to this sort of one of our final questions, which is, what is Aretian working on these days? Are there any projects or specific lines of research that are really fascinating to you at the moment?
Yeah, there's a couple of lines that we have that we're very, very excited about. One is, up to this point, we develop our own software, initially in the US, then Europe, then the world. We've been applying it primarily in a consulting capacity for boutique urban design master planning, combining urban design, building massing, architectural massing, land use attribution, etc., with economic strategy and special programming. That's been a large chunk of our work up to today. But this, over the last year, we've been developing our first full-blown software solution in terms of a digital twin, a city digital twin. We started out of the metropolitan region of Barcelona, but right now we're in the process of deploying that in other European, American, and global cities around the world. And this is very exciting because what we've seen is that the deployment of these techniques by means of digital twins on an ongoing basis, where it's not only a one-off exercise for a given plot of land or a property, it's an ongoing, like a video game for adults, if you will. It's very exciting. It allows you to observe and learn from things that maybe you may not necessarily pay attention to, and helps you understand these patterns much better. We've had a number of good news in recent months in terms of public administration and private agents following the recommendations of the digital twin to make critical decisions. Even in Hospitalet in Barcelona recently, last week, that was in the newspapers last week, a week ago, they decided to demolish two entire neighborhoods and rebuild them with lower density, because in that case it was the two densest neighborhoods in Europe. They were concentrated in that area. We recommended 3 or 4 months ago that should be demolished and redesigned entirely, right? That was at the times of the Franco right-wing dictatorship that was based upon really low-quality urbanism and totalitarian urbanism at large. So we suggested that should be demolished and rebuilt, and it seems like they're considering to really demolish, rebuild it with better density and more quality, higher quality design, and then distribute a bit more of the population in different areas in a more humane way. We're also seeing some of these interventions or these recommendations being followed by clients around the world, and this is very, very reassuring, and they get very often, just in a matter of weeks or months, good response of, oh, having a clear vision that's aesthetically pleasant and grounded on data facilitates that. For example, investors that were on the fence, whether they would invest or not, they decide, no, let's put the money up front here. Let's invest. There's a clear vision here in the long term. These people know where they want to go, right? And obviously then you can adjust, you can refine, you can improve things, you can correct things. But if you have an overall vision that's enticing and it's focused on serving the people, in general, that's proven to be very effective. So the two main ideas would be, one, the software that people will be able to use in a recurrent basis, hundreds of professionals in a given software, that's one. And the other is more on the research, innovation, or geared towards application specifically for the master planning side, is that we did a lot of evaluation of pre-existing urban contexts, great, architectural spaces, whatever. We've also started evaluating archetypal patterns, like more abstract, pure patterns, geometric patterns of architecture, urbanism, streets, and all of that, and architecture patterns and connectivity and whatnot. Okay, gradients of self-similarity, fractality or excellence, gradients of density, gradients of connectivity, gradients of entropy, gradients of this and that. See how the properties change, right? Or with these different geometric shapes in a way. So, okay, we'll learn bottom-up inductive reasoning from the experience. We'll learn top-down from abstract theoretical approaches. And then what we want to go, we haven't get there yet, we're almost getting there, is the third step, which is abductive reasoning, which is in a systematic way integrating what we learn from the pre-existing environments, what we learn from the pure models, and try to integrate that with some degree of generative design into new spaces that need to be designed or repurposed in terms of urban regeneration, urban renewal. That's the third step. We're getting into that territory. It's not going to be solved in a couple of days. It's going to take us a year or two to have the initial model fully functioning, but we're very excited because we're starting to get very cool results there.
Well, we're really looking forward to seeing the outcomes of that initiative. Look, Ramon, it's been an amazing conversation so far. We've taken a lot of different turns. And I think that a lot of your work involves looking backwards at what has worked and projecting forward. So we always ask our guests this final question, which is, in the future, when we look back at the time that we are currently occupying, how will we describe it?
It's a great question. I think it's a times of explosion, of exploration, and it's a bit of a new renaissance in a sense, where we have acknowledged that the extreme atomization of practice, knowledge, and profession, it gets to a point where it provides diminishing returns. You need to go back to this more integrated, holistic view and the way in which you look at urbanism. And if we embrace it in a rigorous and creative way, and constantly trying to learn and to improve and to refine, that could be a bit of a renaissance time, in the sense that we're going to be able to raise the standards collectively, learn from some of the mistakes of the recent past and the distant past, and try to embed some of these practices in a way that's both generalizable, so that millions of people around the world benefit from these knowledge advances and design advances and practice advances, but at the same time, the concrete manifestations of this architectural design, this city conception, this urban ambience that we've created here and there, are at the same time unique and singular. They have their own personality. They're not generic and low quality, banal, and mundane. So I think the combination of high standards with the muscle of analytics, reinforced with this human touch, can create some of the most beautiful, desirable, and attractive urban environments that we've ever seen, and ideally inducing types of social relationships that make a society, I think, freer, more egalitarian, and more humane. And I think that's ideally what we should see when we look into our times in retrospect.
Incredibly insightful response, and I hope that that's where we get to in the future. Well, listen, thank you, Ramon, for joining us. Such an insightful conversation. I think what really resonates with me is also your personal journey, going from observation to understanding to application, and being very decided in how you move through that phase. And I wish the best for you and for Aretian. If people want to learn more about you and about what Aretian is up to, where could they go to find out?
Yeah, a great question, Alex. So our web, aretian.com, is an easy introduction into what we do. And there they can find, for example, references of our book, City Science Performance Follows Form, that you and Libo were referencing at the beginning of the conversation. We published it a year ago. It includes 100 global profiles of global cities, as well as 12 chapters where we introduce our theory and our conception of urban design practice. There's also some white paper reports like the Atlas of Innovation Districts in the US, or a recent study a couple of months ago where we compare very different cities like Amsterdam, Boston, Barcelona, Munich, Stockholm, and we try to extract lessons learned from the past, from urbanism and economics, to come up with interesting strategies for housing, mobility, economics, urban design, etc. And there's also a few scientific papers we publish along the way, and we're going to be publishing in the coming months a number of projects that we're very excited that we're developing in Rio de Janeiro, in Cape Town, in Montreal, in Canada, in the States, in Europe, and in Mexico City, many cities in the Middle East, in Asia, in many cities around the world that we're very, very excited about. And hopefully between the sample applications into master planning projects, the book references, as well as the software that we're going to be presenting in the coming weeks and months, maybe they get a glimpse into how we approach these things. And there's also a contact reference there, so that if someone wants to exchange ideas or have a conversation, we're delighted to try to the extent that that's feasible, to speak with them.
Well, Ramon Gras is a city scientist and co-founder of Aretian Urban Analytics and Design. He's also the co-author of City Science Performance Follows Form. I'm Alex Ewan. For Libo Lee, my co-host, we want to thank Ramon for joining the podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Most Podern on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you leave us a rating and review. It helps us bring on more interesting and insightful guests just like Ramon to share with you how the built environment is shaping into the future. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트